Christmas morning of the year 800, you are standing in the sanctuary of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The air smells of tallow candles, and the light coming through the high windows falls in cold columns across the marble floor. Gathered around you is a crowd of Roman clergy, Frankish nobles, and papal officials, people who have been scheming for months, perhaps years, towards this precise moment. At the altar, kneeling in prayer, is a man so large he seems to belong to a different species than everyone else around him. His hair is fair, his neck thick, his presence large and animated. He is 6'4", in a world where most men barely clear 5'7". He is the most powerful man in Western Europe. In 30 seconds, someone is going to place a crown on his head and alter the echoes of history. His name is Charles. History calls him Charlemagne. And the question of whether he knew what was happening or that it was the culmination of one of the most savvy political maneuvers in medieval history is still being argued about 1,200 years later. Welcome to Venerable Lives. I'm your host, Thomas. This is a podcast about the single most defining moments that made people into the figures history remembers. Today's episode is about the king who unified Europe for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire. The man who launched a literary and educational renaissance while he himself struggled to write his own name, and who ruled one of the largest empires in the world. He was ruthless, contradictory, and violent, but his vision shaped European history. He was a warrior who valued learning. He was a king who wanted to be an emperor, and who spent his entire reign arranging for someone else to crown him so that the idea could seem to come from God rather than from ambition. This is the story of Charlemagne, and it starts the way all great stories about power start. Not with a throne, but with a father. Pepin the Short was not a man you would have noticed in a room full of kings. He was short. The nickname is historical fact. He was unremarkable in appearance, but he possessed something far more valuable than a commanding presence. He possessed the papal blessing. In 751, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king of the Franks, a dynasty that had ruled for over 2 centuries, and crowned himself. He was able to do this because he had convinced the Pope that God approved. The Church blessed the transfer of power, and the precedent was set. Frankish kings and Roman popes were now partners in ruling the Christian world. Neither could do it alone. It was into this world that Charlemagne was born, most likely in 748, the eldest son of Pepin and a Frankish noblewoman named Bertrada of Laon. We know almost nothing about his childhood. What we know about how he grew up, we have to infer from his later habits, his obsessions, and the gaps in his education that show up in adulthood. He was trained as a Frankish warrior prince, which meant horses, hunting, military tactics, and the ceremonial rhythms of court life. He was immersed in the politics of the church from birth. He watched his father maneuver between the papacy and Frankish nobility with extraordinary skill. Here is my first question. What does it do to a boy to grow up watching a father hold a kingdom together through the force of personality in a papal handshake? Does it teach him ambition? Or does it simply teach him that power is always a transaction, that the man at the top is always in debt to someone? When Pepin died in 768, he divided his kingdom between his 2 sons in the Frankish tradition. Charlemagne received the western and northern lands, and his younger brother Carloman received the southern and eastern lands. They were crowned on the same day at different locations, and almost immediately the relationship between them became strained. They were rivals sharing a kingdom, and it couldn't last. And lucky for Charlemagne, it didn't have to. On December 4th, 771, Charlemagne died suddenly. He was 20 years old. Charlemagne moved immediately, not with grief, but with speed. Within weeks, he had absorbed Carloman's territories, scattered his brother's loyalists, and unified the Frankish kingdom under his sole rule. Whether Carloman's death was natural or arranged is a question no one has ever been able to answer definitively. What is certain is that Charlemagne was ready for it, and that he wasted not a single day of opportunity it created. He was 23 years old. He was sole king of the Franks, and the first thing he did was go to war. The Saxons had been a problem for the Frankish kingdom for as long as anyone could remember. They were a confederation of Germanic tribes living in what is now northern Germany, and they were fiercely and violently opposed to two things: Frankish rule and Christianity. Charlemagne decided to solve both problems at once. Beginning in 772, and continuing for the next 32 years, he waged what can only be described as a war of total subjugation. He burned Saxon sacred sites, he built forts deep in Saxon territory, and he converted populations by force, baptizing captives and then executing those who reverted to paganism. He issued a legal code, the Saxon Capitulary, that prescribed death for practicing pagan rituals, desecrating churches, and for refusing baptism. He turned Christianity into a weapon and wielded it with the same methodical ferocity he brought to every military campaign. Can a man who commits mass atrocities also be the father of a renaissance? Can the same man really be responsible for both? It's complex, but we'll get there. History remembers atrocities and accomplishments. In October of 782, at a place called Verden, in what is now Lower Saxony, Charlemagne had captured a large group of Saxon rebels following a battle. He ordered them executed, all of them. The Royal Frankish Annals, compiled at his own court, record that 4,500 Saxons were beheaded in a single day. Contemporary historians debate whether the precise figure is accurate or inflated for rhetorical effect. What they do not debate is whether the massacre happened. It did, and it sent a message that reverberated across the Saxon territories for the remainder of the war. Resistance would cost you everything. Charlemagne led 53 military campaigns over the course of his reign, many of them against the Saxons, and in every campaign season he was personally present and commanded his forces. Year after year, spring to autumn, he rode into hostile territory, built fortified camps, and accepted the submission of Saxon leaders. He would watch those leaders revolt the following year, and ride north again. The cycle was nearly endless. He must have known, somewhere in the 4th decade of that war, that he was not subduing a people, but grinding them into a shape they would eventually hold. The Saxons did not choose Christianity. They accepted it the way a broken bone accepts a splint. And 3 generations later, the difference between choosing and being forced was invisible to anyone who was not there. The Saxon Wars finally ended in 804. By then, the Saxons had been Christianized, forcibly integrated into the Frankish legal system, and absorbed into an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the Danube River, and from the North Sea to northern Italy. Charlemagne had built the largest political entity in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. The question now was what to call it, and who, precisely, was in charge of it. Enter Pope Leo III. Leo became pope in 795, and almost immediately found himself in the kind of trouble that popes of the era were perpetually vulnerable to: factionalism within Rome. The Eternal City in the late 8th century was not a place of spiritual tranquility. It was a viper's nest of aristocratic rivalries, competing loyalties, and ancient family grudges. Leo had enemies, specifically the relatives and allies of his predecessor, Pope Adrian I, who resented that Leo had assumed the papacy over their objections. On April 25th, 799, during a religious procession through the streets of Rome near the Flaminian Gate, those enemies made their move. A mob ambushed the procession and seized Leo. They pulled him from his horse, threw him to the ground, and attempted to gouge out his eyes and sever his tongue, injuries specifically intended to render him unfit for office. Whether they partially succeeded before being interrupted, or whether Leo escaped with fewer injuries than the accounts suggest, is debated. What is not debated is what Leo did next. He fled Rome, he crossed the Alps, and he threw himself on the mercy of the only man powerful enough to restore him, Charlemagne. Think about what that journey meant. The head of the Catholic Church, battered and humiliated, crossing mountain passes in the dark of spring to reach a military camp in Saxony. He had nothing to offer but gratitude, and he was banking everything on the idea that Charlemagne would want what only the Pope could give. The meeting happened at Paderborn, where Charlemagne was conducting his annual military assembly. The king received the Pope with great ceremony and honor, publicly, elaborately, in a way that made unmistakably clear that Leo was under his protection. The two men spent weeks together at Paderborn. What was discussed privately in those weeks, no chronicle records with precision, but the aftermath tells the story. Charlemagne agreed to investigate Leo's accusers, restore him to power in Rome, and personally travel south to oversee the resolution. He arrived in Rome in November of 800. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Leo stood before a formal assembly and swore an oath on the Gospels, declaring his innocence of the charges against him. His accusers were arrested, tried, and sentenced to exile. Leo was officially back in charge. The business of the papacy was restored. The Mass at St. Peter's Basilica on December 25th, 800, was presided over by Leo. Charlemagne was in attendance, kneeling at the altar to pray, a posture of humility that was also, in the ceremonial logic of the medieval church, a posture of availability. As he rose from prayer, Leo stepped forward and placed a golden crown on his head. The assembled crowd, composed of Roman clergy and Frankish nobles, acclaimed him 3 times with a chant reserved for emperors of ancient Rome. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory. Leo then fell to his knees before Charlemagne in the gesture historically reserved for emperors, and just like that, the Western Roman Empire, which had been dead for 324 years, was alive again. So, was Charlemagne surprised? His biographer, Einhard, insisted that he was, that he would never entered the church that day had he known what Leo was planning, that he found the title distasteful, that he was reluctant to accept what had been thrust upon him without his consent. This account was enormously convenient, of course. It made Charlemagne appear humble rather than ambitious, divinely chosen rather than politically maneuvering. It placed the initiative entirely with God and the Pope rather than with the king himself. Modern historians are skeptical. The preparations surrounding the coronation, the careful restoration of Leo, the timing of the Christmas Mass, the presence of a crowd prepared to deliver the exact acclamation chant, all point to extensive prior planning. The historian Rosamond McKitterick and others have argued that Charlemagne had been seeking the imperial title since at least 798. The meeting at Paderborn, in this reading, was not a mercy mission but a negotiation. Leo got his restoration, Charlemagne got his crown. Neither man forgot who owed whom. What Charlemagne actually felt in that moment in the basilica: relief, triumph, irritation at the theatrics, or genuine surprise, we cannot know. What we do know is what he did with the title once he had it. There was one immediate diplomatic complication, and it was a significant one. Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, had never ceased to regard itself as the true and only continuation of Rome. There was already an emperor, as far as Byzantium was concerned, a single legitimate occupant of the Roman throne, even if that throne happened to be in Constantinople rather than Rome. In 800, that throne was occupied by Empress Irene, the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name. Charlemagne's coronation was, from Constantinople's perspective, an act of staggering presumption, the creation of a competing emperor in the West who had no legitimate claim to the title and no recognized authority over Roman territories. Charlemagne handled this the way he handled most political problems: patiently, over time, with a mixture of diplomatic correspondence and implicit military threat. He reportedly even explored the possibility of marrying Empress Irene, which would have unified both empires and resolved the legitimacy question in one stroke. Irene was deposed by her own court in 1802 before any such arrangement could be finalized. The question of Byzantine recognition dragged on for years, eventually resolved not through marriage but through negotiation, the Eastern Empire grudgingly acknowledging Charlemagne's imperial status in exchange for territorial concessions in the Adriatic. It was a settlement that satisfied no one completely, which in diplomatic terms usually means it was the right one. The imperial coronation transformed not just Charlemagne's legal status, but his vision for what he was building. He was no longer merely king of the Franks. He was, in the tradition of the Roman emperors, the protector of the Christian world, the supreme secular authority in the West, the man whose job it was to make civilization. And he took that job with a seriousness that transformed the culture of his empire. Aachen became as Rome. He had chosen the site decades earlier, mostly for strategic reasons, but also because of the natural hot springs. Charlemagne loved to swim, and he would often bathe with dozens of companions at once, a habit that his biographer Einhard describes with admiring detail. At Aachen, he built a palace complex centered on the Palatine Chapel, whose design deliberately evoked the great churches of Constantinople and Rome. It was covered in marble taken from Italian ruins, decorated in bronze and gold, and designed to announce in every architectural detail that what was happening here was the resurrection of an interrupted tradition. To fill that palace with meaning, Charlemagne assembled the greatest scholars of his age. He brought in Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar who was arguably the most brilliant educator in Europe at the time. He made him the head of his palace school. He recruited Italian historians, Visigothic poets, and Frankish administrators. He created an intellectual court that's mission was the recovery and preservation of classical learning, copying manuscripts, standardizing Latin, and reforming the curriculum of monastery schools across the empire. The practical consequences were immense. Charlemagne's writing centers developed a new style of handwriting called the Carolingian minuscule, which was developed to standardize manuscript copying and became the ancestor of our modern lowercase alphabet. Every time you read a printed book, every time you look at a lowercase letter, you are looking at something that has emerged from Charlemagne's determination to make his empire literate. The man who launched a literacy revolution, who made Alcuin the head of his school, who gathered scholars and poets and historians to his court and demanded that they write, copy, teach, and preserve. That man kept wax tablets under his pillow at night and practiced drawing letters in the dark. He could not write, not properly at least, not with the fluency of the educated men around him. Einhard puts it plainly. He He tried to learn late in life and never fully mastered it. The handwriting on the tablets under his pillow was clumsy and imprecise. The most literate empire builder in early medieval history went to his grave still struggling with the thing he wanted everyone else to be able to do. Is there something clarifying about that? A man so committed to something he couldn't personally do that he built an entire civilization around it? Or is it simply a reminder that the people who change the world are not always the best people to do it? The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians call it, was not just an educational project. It was a claim about what Europe was and what it could be. A literate Christian nation organized around law, learning, and the authority of a single emperor who stood between the barbarism of the past and the ordered world of the future. Charlemagne believed this deeply enough to fund it, to staff it, to personally sit at the feet of a Yorkshire scholar in his late 50s to try and learn grammar. He was ridiculous and magnificent at the same time, and that combination is perhaps what made him. The practical work of that Renaissance was unglamorous and vast. Alcuin and his scholars identified that the Latin in which most church documents were written had drifted into regional variants. Different parts of the empire were writing different versions of the language, which meant the documents that held the empire together administratively and spiritually could no longer be read with confidence across all its territories. Charlemagne's solution was to standardize. He ordered monasteries throughout the empire to correct their texts against approved originals. He funded the copying of manuscripts on a scale that had not been attempted in centuries. He established schools, not just at Aachen, but at cathedrals and monasteries across the empire, requiring that basic literacy be taught to the clergy and encouraging it among the common people. He was not just building an empire, he was building an infrastructure for transmitting knowledge. Much of what we know today about classical Rome and Greece today survived because 9th century monks working in workshops that Charlemagne's patronage made possible. Charlemagne did not leave his personal life in any cleaner order than his political one. He had at least 5 wives and partners over the course of his reign, and somewhere in the vicinity of 18 children, legitimate or otherwise. He married his children's mothers in sequence, buried several of them, and in the end lived without a formal wife for the last decade of his life. He refused to let his daughters marry, keeping them at court their entire lives, surrounding himself with their companionship, arranging church careers for his sons while his daughters remained under his roof. The biographers of his era found this arrangement notable enough to record. The explanations they offered were diplomatic, but the truth of it died with him. His physical presence remained extraordinary into old age. Einhard describes him with the affectionate precision of a man who knew him well. Large animated eyes, fair hair gone to gray, a thick neck, a belly that his physicians worried about, and a bearing, despite all of it, that filled every room he entered. He was the kind of person you could not look away from. He hunted obsessively into his 70s. He rode horses constantly. He complained about the fasts his doctors prescribed and ate roasted meat against their advice. He conducted business during the middle of the night because he couldn't sleep, receiving petitioners and dictating letters in the hours that should have been given to rest. He was to the end a man who would not stop. He died on January 28, 814, in his palace at Aachen of lung inflammation. He was somewhere between 65 and 72 years old. Louis the Pious, his surviving son and designated heir, arrived within weeks to assume control of the empire his father had spent 40 years building. The Palatine Chapel became Charlemagne's tomb. Within 30 years of his death, the empire he had unified was divided into 3 kingdoms by the Treaty of Verdun, the process that would eventually produce France, Germany, and the territories between them. The unified Europe Charlemagne had imagined lasted in its original form less than a single generation after him. What lasted instead was the idea, the template of a Christian empire, the precedent of an emperor crowned by the Pope, the practice of systematic learning and manuscript preservation, in the habit of building palaces that announce their civilization's ambitions in stone. Charlemagne was a man who lived with the weight of an impossible job and made it heavier on purpose. He could have been a competent Frankish king. There were plenty of those. Instead, he decided he was going to be the heir to Rome. He decided his empire was going to be literate. He decided his legacy was going to be measured not just in the territory conquered, but in the text preserved, the schools built, and the uniform script that would survive him by 12 centuries and counting. He decided all of this while conducting dozens of military campaigns, managing a family of 18 children, negotiating with a grateful but self-interested papacy, and lying awake at night pressing a stylus into wax, trying one more time to make the letters come out right. Here is the question I leave you with. What is the thing you are building that is larger than you can personally master? What is the civilization you are trying to make possible, even if you can't be its best citizen? Charlemagne could not write about the Europe he wanted, so he built it through the scholars he paid, in the schools he founded, in the scripts that emerged from his workshops, in the chapel that still stands in Aachen today, with its marble floors and its octagonal dome, announcing quietly to anyone who walks in that someone, once, refused to accept that great things were over. The coronation on Christmas Day of the year 800 was the moment his ambition became official. Whether it surprised him or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is what he did with it. He took the title of emperor and immediately began trying to deserve it, not through personal brilliance. He was a great warrior and a shrewd politician, but he was not a philosopher or a theologian or a scholar. He tried to deserve it by surrounding himself with people who were all of those things, by making their work possible, by funding and protecting a culture of learning that the wars he fought had threatened to extinguish. He was violent, and he was generous. He was ruthless, and he was curious. He ordered massacres, and he changed the world in a positive way. He is the reason English has lowercase letters, and a concept of itself as a civilization rather than a collection of competing tribes. He is also the reason 4,500 Saxons were beheaded on a riverbank in 782. Charlemagne was not a good man by any measure that would satisfy us today. He was something more complicated and more consequential than that. He was a man who decided, against all evidence of his personal limitation, that his job was to make the world more literate, more ordered, and more beautiful than he had found it. And then he went and did it, imperfectly, at enormous cost, for 40 years, until lung inflammation finally stopped him. That is the story of Charlemagne. I'm Thomas, and thank you for listening to Venerable Lives. If this episode moved you, sent you to a search engine, or made you want to argue with someone about medieval history, please share it. New episodes drop regularly here and on all podcast platforms. Subscribe for free at venerablelives.com, where you can find the newsletter that goes along with each episode. We will see you next time.